Hello, everyone, and thank you for all joining today. My name is Jean Ann Restivo, and I'll be presenting today's webinar titled A CAP Inspector's Approach and Strategy During Inspection. Before we get started, I'd like to share some background information about myself. I currently run a pathology laboratory of about 10 techs, 11 residents, and about 12 pathologists. Our lab performs routine histology, frozen sections, grossing, special stains, immunohistochemistry, and we perform autopsies. I've been in my current leadership role for 6 years and in the field for 12 years. I started as a generalist, working in the areas of microbiology, chemistry, and hematology, and moved over to the histology pathology field in 2011. I received my master's in 2012 and became supervisor in 2014. Our lab is both CAP accredited and receives routine inspections from New York State. I have a lot of experience with inspections from both a leadership role and as a bench technician. And while every inspection is different, there are key characteristics and methods that are used as a baseline for every inspection. And today we will go into depth of these methods and thought process of the inspector. There is no doubt that inspections can be stressful for both the lab and inspection team. The goal of today's webinar is to minimize stress, maximize efficiency, and take back with you the information learned here today and make it part of your own lab. No matter what your role is, you can never be too prepared. I also hope this webinar will inspire you to become a CAP inspector. Our objectives for this presentation will be to help you prepare for CAP inspection from the perspective of the inspector, decrease the stress factor by being confident and knowledgeable, understand the areas that are most focused on and what questions are always asked, learn what the R.O.A.D approach is and how that is used by the inspectors, and help prepare not only yourself as a leader, but your team member to be able to engage with the inspectors and show that assurance. Our discussion will follow the following format. We will first discuss what the inspectors are really looking at during the initial tour. We'll go into depth into new instrument validation, new testing that's being added on and validation, tissue processing program validation, previous citations and corrections with follow-up, and discuss preparing crosswalks for the inspectors to reference as an added-on pathway for their questions. We will discuss what the R.O.A.D theory means and then use that theory for each of these phases. So first we'll go into pre-analytical phase and we'll touch base on requisitions, specimen collection, accessioning, and referrals. The analytical phase, which would consist of policies and procedures, safety, proficiency testing, quality control, training and competency, instrument maintenance and calibration, and reagent validation. And finally, the last phase of post-analytical, which is the reporting, the corrected reports, critical values, your lab information system, filing and retrieval, and specimen retention. You are notified that the inspection team is on site and you're asked to arrive at the meeting site. You want to make sure that you are waiting for them. While inside, your heart may be racing, you're very nervous. Maybe this is your first inspection as a new supervisor or not really knowing what to expect. When you're waiting for them, it shows a sense of you're taking pride in what you want to accomplish and you want to learn. And you would just start by, they'll go around the room. Usually the leader of the CAP inspection will announce themselves, they'll announce where they're from, they will go into depth on, who will be working with who when they introduce themselves. So when it gets to you, you want to keep it simple. You state your name, you say, you can even say how long you've been in the field and that you're happy to welcome them in and you look forward to learning from each other. First impressions can steer the course of the inspection. So, if you have a supervisor coming in all disheveled and late, and it just leaves a really bad impression. So you would always try to make sure that you're prepared as best as possible. The next is the activity menu. So prior to inspection, the inspectors will have a roster of everyone along with your activity menu. So they usually prepare the days before based off of the activity menu. And usually during the tour, they will refer back to the activity menu. So if you perform immunohistochemistry, they'll want to see and tour that area. A common deficiency is the activity menu not matching what is actually being performed. So make sure it is up to date. One experience I had was our lab had we still do have two locations, and we merged into one. So while the processes were in place and all my policies were revised, the activity menu was never revised. And luckily, our QA manager sent out the activity list a month before the window opened, and we caught it before. But it was a near miss, and it could have been a deficiency. So even though the tour usually runs about 15 to 20 minutes, a lot of information is gathered during this time. While going through individual areas, the inspectors will ask you what you brought on board, if you brought any new instrumentation or any new testing. So for immuno, if you brought any new antibodies or special testing, maybe you got rid of some special testing, maybe you were doing it manually and you got a new special stainer that's now automated. So you want to make sure they'll want to see that, and they'll look for it. So if you say you're doing something manually and then they tour the lab and they see that you're running something that's automated, you'll have to show them that validation. Also include the policy that goes along with the validation to not only show them, but check yourself to ensure you are following the policy. Also include a copy of the training and competency of the text in the binder. Being organized and having all information in a clear and upfront manner creates a positive atmosphere for both you and the inspector. What I tend to do is for each book, for each new instrument, any new validation has its own little binder. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but it has a summary page. It has what the testing is, the policy and the competencies and the training of everyone. And it's in a little binder, and I have it waiting so that after the tour, they come into wherever they're going to be seated at, and I give it to them. Something else on the tour of safety. So while touring, the inspectors look to see if proper PPE is being followed, chemical storage, the labeling, the waste, where is it? Is everything capped correctly? Is there enough space where it's sitting in a tub so that if there's a leak in the carboy or anything, where is that going? All of that they look at, and you'll see them. Sometimes they jot notes, sometimes they just know what to eyeball. It also depends on the inspector. Some of them they've been in this field, they've had so many inspections. Some are very new. Usually the newer ones have the notepad and are taking notes and writing everything, and you can pretty much gauge how they are based off of these tours. They also look at the air and hood safety check, so usually that has a little sticker on it. They might glance at that. The eye wash and shower logs, which should be posted by the areas. So that's always, we used to have it in a QC book, especially in the morgue. And one of the recommendations was, no, put it out there so you remind not only you, but your staff that I need to fill out this QC for the eye wash and the shower. And also just make sure it's always cleaned, it's wiped down. There's some, if there's any dust on it, make sure that that's all cleaned out. Temperature logs of whatever is posted. They'll go more into depth when you do the tracer, but for right now, we're talking about the tour, and this is what they tend to focus on. If the inspector notes improper QC during the tour, they may gear towards policies and procedures, maintenance logs. So if they notice the hoods or chemicals aren't labeled properly, then they may go into depth with safety and ask maybe for your chemical inventory list and chemical hygiene plan and risk assessments. So the tour is very important. It's not just a 1, 2, 3, I'm just going to tour you and walk you through, and here is this, 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 and this. So all of these things can play a role in how the rest of the inspection does go. For the tissue processing programs, a common deficiency is tissue processing programs currently on the processor are not reflected in the policy. What tends to happen, like all of us know, is some pathologists will come and say, I don't like the way that this tissue is looking. Maybe something is wrong with the tissue processor. We don't know if it was just, I have an Excelsior and a VIP. So sometimes when it's fresh alcohol, it tends to be a little dry. They tend to be a little cracked. We have a breast pathologist who always complains that the breast is a little fatty. We don't want to put it for reprocess. Can you change the formalin? So what happens is you may change, okay, we'll change it a couple of minutes, And you may think that that's not, a major change, but it is. Any change, and any change that doesn't match the policy will be a deficiency. It does depend on the inspector, but I have had inspectors who asked me first if we've made any changes to the tissue processing program. So once you say no, okay, they'll go walk over to the programs, and mostly if they don't know how to work the machines, they will ask you, okay, let me see how the tissue processing program looks, and they will go and verify and then ask for the policy. So not right up front. This will happen during the initial tour. They'll look at the tissue processors. They may ask to see, how they may ask you first, did you change any tissue processing programs? If you say no, they might fall back on it later on. But this is something that I just wanted to mention, because to us, like I said, it's even if it's 1 to 2 minutes, it doesn't seem like much, but if it's any sort of change, it has to be reflected in a policy, and you would have to change the whole, you would have to do a validation of it. So it is very important that the pathologists also realize, this is not just we can't just tweak it a little bit without really, unless it's a real major issue that you see happening over time. The rule of thumb, so any change, small or large, if there is a policy, which we have policies for everything, revise it immediately to avoid it being overlooked. And on the bottom of the programs or QC, note the policy it addresses as a reminder for updating it. That's something new that I did that was requested by New York State, was any of the QC forms, any of the QC sheets, put the policy number on a footnote so that you can refer back to that quickly, and you don't have to flip through policy books, or it's a reminder, hey, I have to make sure that I change this policy. Also, if you keep your program posted on the wall or on the processor, make sure it is signed off and up to date. Sometimes I don't like to keep anything on the walls. I like to keep everything either in the QC book so that they can reference, or in my policy book. The best place for the program information is in the QC book and in the policy manual. Having it in too many places can increase the chances of you forgetting to update it, or leaving leaving it out and forgetting about it, or even putting another paper over it. That has to be signed every year. So sometimes if you have a 4-page policy and you're only really interested in the first page, you put the first, that's what happened to me. We put the first page of, say, we have to do manual H&E because our H&E stainer is down. We would take it, we would put it out, and then we would leave it out, and then the inspectors come and say, well, where's the signature page? How do we know that this is the correct one that you're using? And we were cited for that. So from then on, everything is off the wall. Anything that needs to be referenced is referenced through the QC book in different sections, in different areas, and in the policy book. Previous citations. Along with the activity menu and the roster that I talked about in the beginning, the inspectors are also given a list of previous inspection citations. They will ask you for the corrective actions that are taken. A good tip is keep a folder of the previous inspections with citations and corrections. Include copies of any policies that were updated or QC sheets that were added. Also include any audits as if they were part of the corrective action. Just be sure you are performing them at the required interval. Another tip is review this book during your off year, so your self-inspection year. Oh, the year that you don't have inspection would be, you would be performing your self-inspection, or maybe another sister hospital, if you're a part of a bigger umbrella corporation, will come and inspect you. Make sure that this is a time to review all of that again, to make sure that if you say, I said I was going to be doing this type of corrective action, or I said I was going to be doing this audit to correct this, if you're not doing it, you at least have a whole year to do it, and then show for the following year, hey, listen, this is what I've been doing for the whole year, and this is how I've been helping in the corrective actions. They will always look at that citation, and they will set. That's one of another common areas. That's one of the first things that they do ask, is because sometimes they come every other year. So it's sometimes not so obvious that, okay, what did I do? I don't remember what I did that year before, or I don't remember. So it's always good to just keep it somewhere where you can always reference, and it's all together. So being organized seems to be the best route. to handle these types of inspections because there's so much information in these requirements. Also, depending on what you have. See, I have a lot of areas in my hospital, perhaps in my labs. Maybe some of you guys don't have that many. So it's really dependent upon, what your lab offers in terms of pathology and histology. Creating crosswalks. While performing an internal inspection at one of my other sister hospitals, as an inspector, I was given a crosswalk for each regulation. And what it was is they gave me a book and they said, okay, every policy, they listed it in order. I'm not policy, I'm sorry. Every requirement that was listed in order of what they've shown that they did on their activity menu, they had a policy number that referred back to that requirement. And it gave me the policy name and the number. And then they gave me the policy book and they let me go through it. And I went down the line and I thought that this was very helpful because I, as an inspector, this was one of my first inspections doing as an internal inspection of another hospital, and I didn't know where to start. There's so much information that I have to, look at. I don't know where to begin. So I thought by having this was great. And then I took that information back to my lab, and what I did was I created these, they're called CAP books, and there's this big CAP books, and every requirement, as soon as the new year of the requirements come out, they're updated. I print out each requirement on its own separate paper. It's followed by how I use a policy and the example of the requirement of how I fulfill that CAP requirement. It is tedious and it requires continuous updating, but it does take away from the page flipping and back and forth running with the QC books and policy books and, oh, I need to see this or I need to see that. Having these books in front of you, it also makes you look at beforehand examples of reporting, or you may want to put, if you run ER, PR, you may want to put the comparisons in there already. So when they say, okay, I'm going to need this, you say, oh no, here I have a CAP book that has this all of this information already in there for you. Please look through it, and if you require any other further information, or I can always be of assistance. And then this way, it lets them look, and it lets them, put little sticky notes of what questions they want to ask and everything, and or what they want to look at then, and it really does just make the whole experience just much better for everyone. So my email is given at the beginning of this presentation, and I would be happy to go over in depth how I made the books and how I maintain them. Okay, so in order for us to learn how the inspectors use the R.O.A.D methodology, we first need to understand what is the meaning of R.O.A.D. R.O.A.D stands for read, review, which we would read, review policies and logs. The next is observe. Based on policies, look to see if these policies are currently being practiced. The next is ask. So this is where the inspectors will interview the staff and yourself and look to see and if it's actually accurate with what is being observed and what they read. And discover is if there are issues that arise during these other processes, they will further evaluate corrective actions and/or resolutions. For the pre-analytical phase, we will break up the next section into the pre-analytical, the analytical, and the post-analytical topics as it relates to AP examining the R.O.A.D theory used in each phase. So we're going to start with the pre-analytical phase. During this phase, the inspector will read and review a sampling of surgical specimen handling, collection, retention, policies and procedures, suboptimal specimen policies, and rejection logs. During this phase, the inspector will observe sampling of primary specimen containers. They'll want to make sure that they're labeled properly. They will reference back to what your policy is for how specimen identification, and they will look now to see, okay, is this being labeled with this? Do they have all of the requirements that they're saying that they're being labeled with? Are there two identifiers? Things like that. The sampling of tissue blocks. So what they'll do is they'll look to see if you have any sort of barcode on them or writing. They'll look to see how clear that is. They will also observe the tech's daily routine of receiving a specimen and accessioning the specimen into the system. And the inspectors will compare what is observed with what is written in the policy to check for any discrepancies. A tip is during the yearly competencies and assessments for the accessioning team, have the policy pertaining to the competency handy and review it with everyone to make sure that the correct process is being reflected in their actual practice. Because sometimes they may do something that will benefit them, especially if you have a big team. Not everybody is going to, they may do something a little bit differently, and then somebody might say, oh, that's much better. Let me just do that. And, as a manager and as a supervisor, you're not always on the bench to, see these little things. Maybe you are, which is great of having a supervisor who's also a bench tech. But for those who aren't, this is a great time when you can actually look and really, really focus on what they're doing, how they're doing it, and okay, is this policy being followed? Because that's exactly what the CAP inspectors will look to do. The grossing stations. Typically, the inspectors will watch maybe a couple of examples of how the grossing technicians or residents or whoever you have grossing, they'll watch for examples of grossing procedure to ensure each one is being handled as per the policy and also to minimize cross-contamination. One way our lab meets this criteria was we color coordinate each of our grossing stations, and at every station supply them each with their own scale and an own set of utensils. This kind of eliminates the whole back and forth, especially if you only have one person who's grossing and they're going to be doing frozen sections and cutting at the main station. So, and if it's all in the same area, which my lab is, we all have it, it's all in one room. Sometimes you don't mean to take that forcep and then you go to cut a frozen and you realize, oh, I never washed it or I never did something like that. Some areas I've been in have their frozen section, their cryostats in a suite, in the surgical suite, completely away from the grossing room. So it just all depends on your own lab format. But that's something that we did that we find very useful. We haven't, luckily, knock on wood, have any concerns over any kind of contamination issues, and it really seemed to minimize even near misses. Once the inspector completes their observation, they will look on to asking some common questions. So they may ask the staff of accessioners what your best course of action is when you receive an unacceptable pathology specimen. Or how does your lab ensure specimen identity throughout processing and examination? Or how do you ensure that there is no cross-contamination? And does your lab exclude any specimens? Because these are all part of the requirements. So you need a policy for what's excluded. So this can be very overwhelming for the tech, but they're not expected to know as far as like exclusion, like what specimens are excluded from pathology. Most of them all know, but to have to be, to put them on the spot and, they may get fluttered, they may get confused. They can always say, let me go and refer back to my policy and procedure manual. They don't have to be so name every single one of them, but some of these questions they pull based on what they see. So, and the requirement. So our requirement is, you need to have some sort of policy or procedure for unacceptable pathology specimens. You have a rejection log, things like that. They may question, oh, where is your rejection? Oh, you have a rejection. Where is it? And you'll have to produce that. So those are the types of questions that we're looking at with the pre-analytical phase. And during the discovery phase, the inspector will review areas of weakness or problems that they identified and further evaluate the lab's responses. So they'll go into depth and say, okay, if something was wrong with this, what is your corrective actions or how do you resolve these issues? So say you have a rejection log that isn't filled out properly, like who's following up, does quality management get involved? So all these different things, they'll start to really go in a little bit more in depth based on what they find from the read, observe, and ask. The inspectors compare the procedures to actual specimens, and they determine if unique identifiers are in place for those specimens. That's another discovery phase. And then that is the pre-analytical phase. So we're going to move on to the next phase, which is the analytical phase. As you can see, there is a lot of material to cover and a lot that goes into this section of the inspection. We will use the R.O.A.D theory for each of these topics. And what we'll do is we'll go first into policies and procedures, and we'll talk about what they would read, what they would observe, what they would ask, what they would discover. And we'll go through each one of these areas, covering the most important parts of it. Okay, so for policies and procedures. So when an inspector is reviewing the manual, they'll again refer to the activity menu for the laboratory to ensure that there are no tests that are discordant between the manual and the menu. A common question they ask is if there are any new or significant revised procedures since the last inspection. If they are, they will look to see how did you communicate that with the employees, and have they been educated on the new or revised policies, which is most of the time a read and sign. Maybe you mentioned it, you do it at a monthly meeting. Most of the time, anytime there's a revised policy, if it's the day of revision, you need to do a read and sign, because you have to make sure that this is what's in play now, and you have to make sure all of your staff are aware, and you don't put it into action until everybody has had a chance to review it and sign it. They may also ask to see discontinued policies to make sure that the date taken out of service is indicated and that such policies are retained for at least 2 years. They won't look for it doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you have some procedure for doing it. So whether it's I scan it, like we scan it into a P drive file, and the P drive file has in the computer the discontinued policies, and then I know I keep them on for 2 years based on the date. Whatever it is, as long as you tell them and show them this is what I have, and they can see that this is how it is, it doesn't have to be always the same. They will review about 10 to 15 policies to ensure proper review from the medical director is done at least twice a year. Also, if there's a designee, they will ask to see documentation of the written delegation statement. So make sure that if you have a lead tech, if your area is 24/7, and obviously you can't be there 24/7 if you're a manager, who do you delegate to answer these questions, or run QC, or sign off on new immunoantibodies? If you have to make sure that whoever you delegate to do that there's a designation letter and that it's signed off by the medical director. Also, they may ask if there are more than one copy of the manual. If so, make sure the versions are the same, even online. The tip: if you have any policies hanging up for reference, make sure they are in the QC book and make sure they are signed. So that's what I spoke about before with the tissue processing programs. The inspectors may ask the techs how they assess the procedure manual and how they know about changes in a procedure, to see if what your answer was is matching what they are saying. Most of the time, everyone would answer that the same way, but sometimes you may not do a read and sign, or you may just verbally say something. So just make sure that it's all the same. Safety. Inspectors will want to look at policies on formalin badge monitoring, disposal of medical waste and hazardous waste, and they may want to review the chemical hygiene plan. I also include my chemical inventory list and risk assessment of my staff. One thing I want to just touch base on is the inspectors. So there's a separate safety inspector that will sit with your safety or if you have a safety officer. Before the inspection, the safety officer may go over with the AP inspector some things to look for. Most often I found the AP inspectors perform the safety part and then review it with the safety inspector. So they may say, oh, did you get this, did you see this, did you see that, how was it okay? And most of the time they're okay with doing the safety part, the AP inspectors. The only time I had to sit separately aside from the AP inspector was if there was any sort of issue with any sort of safety that we had, or maybe they had a question about the safety portion of it, they weren't that familiar with it, or if the general inspection of safety was all done and then she was just sitting around, she would come and help out, because AP can be very tedious. They may ask multiple staff members where the safety policies are found, what to do in case of a fire, how spills are handled, and where the MSDS sheets are found. So make sure your staff is properly trained and knows where to find all of these. The inspector will observe the eye wash locations, the handling of medical waste, the chemical labeling, and they will look for the formalin badge monitor report. They will pay particular attention to the level. So they will look to say, do you know your level? And if appropriate action was taken, if these levels were high. I'm not sure where everybody orders their formalin monitoring from, but we use a company that has that prints out, it sends an email right away of when the results are in, whether it's high or normal. It sends it right to the email, and it'll say, have all the descriptions of everything that it is, and then it'll have a little, the value, what it should be, where it's at, and then it'll have a little thing on the bottom that says, reviewed by employee and the date. And I really think that that's great, because that proves that okay, here's that, I'm going to show you, here you signed it, and you go over, it shows that you went over with the staff what their levels are, and if it goes to show if it was high, what kind of actions did you take. PPE usage, they will look to make sure during the initial tour that proper PPE is being followed. If they come to a policy that they see that they may question, why isn't somebody wearing gloves or a face mask? What we did was we put PPE signs and pictograms of what is required in each of the areas. So for accessioning, we put what was required, what was optional. For cutting and hazardous waste, we have different pictograms for each of them and what PPE should be worn. This could be good and this could be bad, because it'll be good, they can see what they should be wearing, but it also then tells the inspector, it's easy for the inspector to see, okay, somebody's pouring out waste, but they're not wearing a face shield, and it's required, so it's very easy for them, while it's easy to say for us, oh, the staff knows because look, it's printed. If they're doing something quickly and they have to get back to doing something else, because I'm sure all of our staff do multiple things a day, they don't just maybe sit and cut or sitting in bed, they're doing so many different things. Oh, I got to change the tissue press, I got to change out the formalin. I mean, normally if there's inspection there, you kind of want to make it, maybe kind of wait until all that is over. But if there is no choice and it has to be done on a normal routine basis, you have to make sure that make sure you're wearing that proper stuff. And it's very important that they perform it consistently every day, not just during inspection. Make sure that they're following. So if you see during a normal day and you see them, stop them and say, no, listen, we understand there's nothing going on, but this is a daily practice and quality control measures that need to be followed, and this is the standard of the laboratory. And that's it. And then this way, when inspection comes, they're not so worried that they're going to do something wrong, or what are they going to ask me? They're prepared. And safety really is a big portion, and it can get you in pretty tight waters. As far as proficiency testing goes, they will look at proficiency testing grade. They'll look at your ERPRs. They may look at what your HQIP was. They will look to make sure that you reviewed it, that it was signed, that the attestation sheet, to ensure that the person testing and the director all have signed off on them. And then they also would look to see how did you communicate those results to the staff. You may say, at the monthly meeting we spoke about it, or when the results came back, we reviewed it, and you would date it and sign it. And that's really all I've ever been in contact with in terms of proficiency testing. Sometimes they may ask the pathologist who read it. It's mainly the signing, the signatures, that's the most important, to make sure that it's, and the follow through. Okay. Quality control. The inspector will want to review the policies for handling QC, who is responsible for handling the QC, and how outliers are handled. They may review the corrective actions for the outliers to ensure that QC is performed daily and that monthly review of the data is being performed. They will review temperature logs, thermometers and timers to make sure they are not expired, and scales to ensure accuracy. So with the thermometers and timers, the timers are a big thing, mainly not so much for in histology if you're not running anything manually. They're mainly F&A adequacy assessments, sometimes the frozen section room, the staining. If anything you say that you use a timer for, they notice that you're using a timer for, you have to make sure that those have a calibration sticker and that they are not expired, because those are things we tend to forget. But it is something that is required and they do expire. So always make sure that you check those. The scales. So in our lab, we have scales for the morgue. We have scales for the grossing room. Pay particular attention to the scales in those areas. Make sure they are calibrated and that the calibration is up to date and noted on the scale. So calibration should be every year. You can do your own weigh-in with the weights twice a year to make sure that it's giving accurate results. If you do use the weights, you have to get those calibrated as well. So keep that in mind. It might just be better to have it, calibrated once a year. It all depends on your budget, because it is a little bit expensive, but you have to ensure that your scales are accurately reading out the right information. For training and competency. So while inspectors may choose randomly from your staff, if possible, provide them with all staff that were involved with the tracer. So you always want to give, and they may ask you for 1 or 2 cases. It depends on what kind of case you give them. So if you give them a case that has all of these different areas, from a frozen section to special stains or immunostains, all of that together, they may not ask for all, so much. But start at the beginning. Start with who accessioned it, who grossed it, who embedded it. If they see that more than 3 or 4, they're not going to pull more than that. They will pull maybe 1 or 2 from the tracer. If you have any new employees, that will be noted on the roster, and they will probably ask for that. They'll probably because they will want to see your initial competency assessment, depending on where it falls, they may look for your 3-month competency, your 6-month competency. They want to make sure that you have all that in order. So you definitely want to make sure that the new hires have, some sort of maybe continuing education, even if it's 1 or 2 credits. So our CAP inspections usually happen in December. So in December, you should almost be done with all of your CE credits for the year. So if they won't give you a deficiency, but it's just not going to look good if you have someone who has, no CE credits yet and it's December. So even if it's just a little bit, and I always give incentive to the employees, if you finish it by this time, it depends all again on how well your lab can be flexible, but we give these things called gem points, which is like recognition points, and it comes out to, it equates to money at the end of the year. You can get a gift card and stuff. So what I tend to do is have them say, okay, if you finish all your CE credits by June, you get 5,000 gem points, and that equates to $25 gift card at the end of the year. So things like that. It just, it's very hard to say because every hospital is different, but that is something that try to give them a little bit of incentive to do. Another tip is to organize each staff member with their own file, and in each organize that into different folders for all of the requirements. Usually job description, resume, license, degree, continuing education, yearly competency. Having that all in one folder, separated out, so you're not skipping through all these pages and trying to find, oh, let me see, did I put this job description? I know it's in here. Oh, the license. It's easy. Oh, I know my license is in there. Well, no. Well, is it a renewed one? Sometimes they don't give you the renewed one. They forget, so it's always good to make sure you look through all of that. Even if it's once a year, you're not asked to do more than that. Once a year, you pull out the file. Okay, my continuing education is good. My competency is up to date. My license is up to date. So work with your QA manager. They can come in if you have one and, hey, look through all my files. Let me know what I'm missing. Also, if there are non-pathologists who perform grossing, the inspectors will ask for ways that you handle issues with grossing and how this is communicated with them. Whether you have a form, whether you have a spreadsheet, whatever it is, they will ask for that. The next one is instrument maintenance and calibration. So basically, this is every instrument that's being in histology. The most common, obviously, is your H&E stainer, your special stains, embedding center, tissue processor, microtomes, immunohistochemistry, cryostats, grossing stations, and last but not least, refrigerators and freezers. Depending on your tracer, you may show them all of these things, but they may not ask for, all of this. It's good to show, it's good to have, but unless they ask for, give me specifics, you give them the, whatever the tracer is and whatever the specimen touches. So if it touches, say you have more than one H&E stainer, you don't have to give them all the H&E stainer maintenance and calibration book. Like, just pull one of whatever the tracer was used. The same thing goes for any of the other instruments that you have multiple of, if you have any multiples of. Pull the one that was related to the tracer, and that'll be more than enough. But make sure that you have all of that maintenance and calibration in either a separate folder. And again, if you want a maintenance and calibration folder, maybe you want to put it in your QC book, whatever works for you, as long as you know where it is and you're able to look at it and you can see it on a consistent basis. So if it's in your QC book, you can see that every month, okay, I know that this is coming up, or this needs to be done. Oh, I have to schedule this. If you see it, then you'll know that it'll have to be done and you can make sure that it gets done. During the specimen tracer, like I said, pull all daily QC, preventative maintenance logs, corrective action logs. For example, if you have a malignant colon case that came through as a frozen, you would pull the cryostat daily QC, decontamination process, tissue processors, embedding center, microtome station, or any special testing. One tip, never give them the entire QC book. By giving just the instrument data from the tracer, it allows you to limit the paper being given and allows you to spot check to make sure that the documents are all complete. They never usually ask, oh, hey, I'm just going to take your QC book, because it's just more paperwork that they don't want to go look through. Give me the QC from this month, or give me that from that month. Okay, let me go get it. And if they're in a meeting spot that's not your office or not somewhere where you have to go in, always proofread whatever you give them, so that if you see something's not right, you have an answer prepared for them. No one is ever perfect. They know that they'll have, but pull a case that is as good as it can be and as good as you can get. Reagent validation is our next topic. Inspectors will ask to see the policy regarding reagent inventory, validation, and lot to lot. Lot to lot's very, very important. And as long as you have a good procedure and a good strategy for doing that, it can be time consuming. But what we do, for example, with antibodies in immuno is when the new antibodies come in, I put it on a spreadsheet, and it's just like a little list, and it's stuck right on the Remuno refrigerator. And anytime they know to go in, they know, to check it off, and it's just something that they can visually see, like, oh, hey, this is a new lot. I need to make sure that I do this if I have space. And it's easier to not miss when it's right in front of you. If you keep it in a policy book, it's going to be very, very hard for you, especially if you have a heavy immuno antibody list. We have over 100 that we run, and it just can get very, very time consuming. But if you have a policy and you have a procedure for doing it, you should be fine. They will spot check a few reagents in there that look to make sure that nothing is expired. That's usually, and that there is an open date, or no, a receive date, an open date, and expired date. So make sure that when you do your walkthrough beforehand, discard anything that's expired. When rounding, if you notice that something is going to expire but might not be, since you don't really know when inspection is, maybe tag it with a sticker or mark it on your calendar to remind you that that time is approaching. So if it does reach that point and they haven't come yet, you can easily rotate that out and you have another one already available that you can put into place. Also, big one, don't forget your secondary containers, especially workstations, your decals, your ammonia water. If you run, we run AFB and Gram offline because it just doesn't really do well with our special stain instrument. Make sure that anything that's poured off has a label on it and has the GHS pictograms on it. Before I go into post-analytical, I just want to go back. I do have I can share with anyone who is interested, a company that has these labels that just came out very recently, and on it has these reagent labels, and on the bottom has all of the pictograms already on them, and all you have to do is you check off whichever one has the pictogram. Instead of having a label, then you have to get your individual pictogram labels and stickers and stick them on. I mean, it looks horrible, and especially they get wet. These labels are great. They're through Market Lab, and if you go, you'll see these labels are fantastic, and they really do help with making sure that everyone is and knows what they're, if they don't know and they drop something, they don't know what it is. I mean, most of the time you can smell it, but you want to know how to treat that, especially if you're not wearing gloves or anything like that. So it is very important to make sure you have that. A post-analytical phase. So real quick, because we're running out of some time, we will go through the reporting, corrective actions, corrected reports, critical values, filing, and specimen retention. For the reporting, like I said, the inspectors usually want to see a variety of different reports, but depending on the tracer you provide, you may only need one or two. Again, like I said before, if you have something with a frozen section, they'll look for a variety of information on the report, including verbal communication, how that was documented. Also, if the frozen was malignant, they will look for, and you most likely have ER, PR, or maybe HER2, the disclaimers that go along with it. Another report the inspectors are eager to look at are cases with consults or cases that are sent out for second opinion. They will refer back to the policies and compare that what the policy states is followed through in the report. For example, if your policy states that when SLARs are sent for review and it is documented in the report, the institution it came from, the date, the address, the phone number, whatever it is, you will bet that the inspectors will look to make sure that each and every one of that criteria that you put in that policy is in that report. So make sure that if you pull anything, that is actually one that is being followed, especially if it's something that your area doesn't do. Say, like, we have a transcription department, which is a different area, even though it's part of pathology, they still has different people that I don't oversee that. So I always make sure I skim through it first. So before you give anything to the inspector, proofread it first. And if you have to, refer back to the policy to make sure that it's what it should say. Corrected reports. Inspectors will want to review amended and corrected reports to ensure proper procedure and notification was made to the physician. They may ask you, how do you handle corrected reports and how is that new result reported? Depending on your LIS system, there may be QA reports that are run. In my own lab, we have Cerner Millennium, and amended reports are generated on a monthly basis and is sent to me for review by myself and my medical director to ensure that proper notification was made, that it's documented. Why was it corrected? Can we have done something differently? And how are we ensuring that we're giving the pathologist enough information that this cannot happen? Was it something that they made a mistake on, or we kind of just look into depth to see if we can decrease that number, if there's any. As we were in the age of technology, some pathologists would rather use email as a form of notification. This is fine as long as they send with a read receipt and that it is saved somewhere on the file for file up. critical values. In pathology, we don't really have critical values, but we do have reporting of significant and unexpected findings, which need to be reported in a timely manner. Inspectors may ask, how do you handle significant and unexpected findings, and how are these communicated? I think every inspector has asked me that so far, and it's a great question, because sometimes if you're not a pathologist, you're like, what do they do? Do they call? Do they, I'm not really sure. So you always try to, when this requirement comes out, and sometimes it gets modified a little bit, you definitely want to reach out to your chief pathologist or your medical director and get their feedback, but not just them. Get like a couple of different pathologists to see, make sure, well, what are you doing, or what are you doing? Don't assume that they're all doing the same thing. In my lab, I found out from reading a report on something completely not inspection related, that it was just a routine audit, that the communication was being delivered via email, but my policy stated that it was being verbally communicated through a phone call. When I asked the pathologist, and she's like, "Oh no, I don't call. I use the computer." And I'm like, "Oh, that's great, but you need to explain. You need to, this is major, like, because this is a major policy. It's part of QA policy, and we have here that we communicated verbally." That we spoke to this doctor on this date at this time. I had to find out, and I made a note to everyone. Hey, listen, if you do something that this is something major, you need to. She didn't think it was major. She just thought, oh, it's an email, and I have a read receipt. Like, I'm doing everything right, which is great. You are following through and closing the loop, but we as laboratory management need to know about that, because we need to incorporate that into a policy. And that's what I had to do. I had to revise the policy, and I also had to let everybody know that, oh, this is an option now if anybody else wanted to do that. Filing and retrieval is our next topic. Inspectors will review the policies on specimen, block, and slide storage. They may want to observe the area to ensure that there's enough space, which none of us have enough space, but as long as it's organized in a way that you're able to get what you need, they understand. Space is always an issue, and many have off-site storage. Inspectors will want to review the process for retrieving of those blocks and slides that are off-site to ensure that the material is readily available. Usually within 24 hours is what their cutoff is. So as long as you can get it here within 24 hours, you are okay. We use an off-site facility. We also have another part of the hospital that they use for storage. So depending on how much, we used to be able to keep 5 years on site. Now we can only keep about 2 years on site. So we've grown, and our filing and retrieval has also grown. Specimen retention. So depending on your state, there may be different time frames for retention of specimens. CAP requires a certain amount of time, but if your state has the most strict guidelines, then you need to follow that. For instance, for us is New York State, I think, is only 10 years, and for here it's 20. So it would need to be always the most stringent, the most strict is what you would follow. Be mindful of autopsy and surgical pathology. Although they are usually generalized together, some inspectors may want to see autopsy and surgical retention times separated, because there's different requirements. So while it's the same information, because there's a separate section in CAP for autopsy and a separate section for surgical pathology, it's a redundant policy, but they still want it separated out. So that was a ding that we got, was I had everything all on one, and they said, well, what about autopsy? And I said, well, that's all part of pathology. And they said, no, we want to see it separated out. And then they explain why. We have different requirements. Autopsy we consider separate from surgical pathology. So just keep that in mind. If you do have a policy, just separate them out so that you have surgical pathology. It's the same information, it's just separate. But again, that was just based on that one inspection. But I thought it was worth noting here. In conclusion, while every inspection is different, there are key items that will always be the driving force behind inspection. You never know your team of inspectors until you meet them, and they all bring a different view based on their own laboratory and even checklist items they were cited for. Always remember, this is a peer group inspection, and keep an open mind to not only learn something new, but maybe shed some light and different perspective from the inspector to bring back to their lab. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.